The story begins in Moscow in the autumn of 1960, at the height of the Cold War. The world was split between two nuclear superpowers, each waiting for the other to make a fatal mistake. American intelligence desperately needed eyes inside the Soviet military. But years of purges, counterintelligence traps, and the watchful paranoia of the KGB made deep penetration nearly impossible. Then, out of nowhere, a single man stepped forward. His name was Oleg Vladimirovich Penkovsky, a highly placed GRU colonel, the Soviet Military Intelligence Service. On the surface, Penkovsky was the image of a loyal Soviet officer, disciplined, decorated, and well-connected. He attended state receptions, worked directly under top military leadership, and had access to classified missile deployment plans. But beneath that crisp military exterior, something was cracking. Penkovsky had grown deeply disillusioned with the Soviet regime, its brutality, its lies, and the growing danger of a nuclear confrontation. He believed that if the world continued down this path, millions would die. And so, in a decision that could cost him his life, he chose to risk everything. In August 1960, during a Soviet trade mission to London, Penkovsky quietly approached two American students near the Bolshoi Theater delegation. He slipped them a message, an offer of cooperation, begging them to deliver it to American or British intelligence. At first, no one believed the note was real. The CIA was hesitant. Could this be a KGB trap? MI6 investigated further. And when they realized the depth of Penkovsky's access, they introduced him to CIA officers working in Moscow. Thus began Operation Hero. Throughout 1961, Penkovsky secretly photographed thousands of pages of Soviet military documents. Using a miniature camera hidden inside a cigarette pack, he passed CIA and MI6 the first accurate specifications of Soviet missiles, launch protocols, and real nuclear capabilities. These revelations shattered the myths that had fueled American fear for years. The United States finally understood the true state of the Soviet arsenal. For the first time, the CIA could distinguish propaganda from real threat. And Penkovsky was just getting started. But he knew the KGB could appear at any moment. He moved cautiously, passing documents during diplomatic functions, park walks, and brief window of opportunity meetings. Every handshake, every coded glance, every secret drop carried the risk of instant execution. Still, he continued. Because he believed the world was heading toward disaster, and only the truth could stop it. As the United States and the Soviet Union drifted closer to nuclear war, Penkovsky delivered the intelligence that would prove decisive. And then, in 1962, the nightmare scenario finally began. When U.S. spy planes discovered Soviet missiles in Cuba, America had almost no time to react. But Penkovsky had already given the CIA something no satellite ever could, the key to preventing World War III. By October 1962, the Cold War reached its most dangerous point. American U-2 reconnaissance flights revealed Soviet R-12 SS-4 and R-14 SS-5 nuclear missiles secretly installed in Cuba, capable of striking Washington, New York, and dozens of U.S. cities within minutes. Panic surged through the White House. Intelligence analysts scrambled to estimate Soviet capabilities, missile readiness, and strike timelines. But the most critical answers weren't coming from satellites or analysts. They were coming from one man in Moscow. For more than a year, Oleg Penkovsky had supplied the CIA with the exact technical manuals, operating procedures, and launch parameters of these same Soviet missile systems. His photographs detailed everything: fuel requirements, warhead yield, launch crew readiness, and most importantly, the minimum preparation time before a missile could be fired. Before Penkovsky, the CIA believed the Soviets could launch within minutes. After Penkovsky, the U.S. knew the Soviets needed hours. That difference wasn't theoretical. It was the difference between nuclear war and a chance at diplomacy. As President John F. Kennedy met with his executive committee ExComm, CIA Director John McCone presented intelligence sourced directly from Penkovsky's documents. These files showed that the missiles in Cuba could not be launched immediately, giving the U.S. time to consider options other than a preemptive strike. Inside the Oval Office, Kennedy repeatedly asked a single question: how long before these missiles are operational? And the answer, based on Penkovsky's intelligence, allowed Kennedy to impose a naval blockade instead of authorizing an airstrike that could have triggered global nuclear retaliation. While the world fixated on Cuba, Penkovsky continued his dangerous work in Moscow. He monitored high-level Soviet reactions, intercepted discussions among GRU colleagues, and signaled to his handlers that the Kremlin was uncertain, even nervous. This human insight, unavailable to any satellite, gave Washington a psychological advantage. But by late 1962, the KGB was growing suspicious. Penkovsky had taken more risks than any other Soviet defector in history. His handlers in MI6 and the CIA urged him to stop. He refused. During the peak of the crisis, Penkovsky sent one last urgent message through his cutout, "Act. Time is short." Analysts later realized he was warning the West that Soviet leadership was divided and unpredictable. Every hour, every move, every miscommunication had the potential to ignite Armageddon. Meanwhile, the KGB's net tightened. Unknown to the West, Soviet counterintelligence teams had begun shadowing foreign diplomats in Moscow, including the MI6 officers handling Penkovsky's dead drops. A single mistake would expose everything: the cameras, the documents, the signals, the meetings. And Penkovsky knew it. On October 22, 1962, as Kennedy addressed the world, the CIA quietly relied on Penkovsky's files to brief NATO allies. American generals repeatedly referenced his data as they prepared for possible invasion scenarios. Penkovsky had become the central pillar of U.S. understanding. And the Kremlin was about to discover why. As the Cuban Missile Crisis peaked, the world held its breath. But inside Moscow, far from the cameras and speeches, another drama unfolded, one that would never be publicly acknowledged by the Soviet Union until decades later. The KGB had begun to sense a leak. Throughout 1962, Soviet counterintelligence officers noticed an unusual pattern. American and British diplomats in Moscow were making strange, unnecessary trips around the city. Some walked alone in parks at odd hours. Others appeared briefly near telephone booths or stairwells and left without making a call. These movements were not consistent with normal diplomatic activity. The KGB's 7th Directorate, the department responsible for surveillance, quietly increased monitoring. Their attention soon centered on two British officers, Greville Wynne, a British businessman and MI6 courier, and Janet Chisholm, the wife of an MI6 officer stationed in Moscow. Both had contact, at different times, with the CIA/MI6 asset codenamed Hero. Meanwhile, Oleg Penkovsky continues operations inside the GRU headquarters. Despite MI6 urging him to slow down, he escalated. The consequences of the Cuban Missile Crisis had convinced him that the Soviet leadership was dangerously unpredictable. Penkovsky felt the West needed more intelligence, not less. But the walls were closing in. The mistake that exposed him. Declassified KGB files later revealed a subtle but fatal detail. Penkovsky had been observed passing an object, later confirmed as film, during a brief encounter with Chisholm near Kutuzovsky Prospect. Surveillance teams noted the exchange but could not immediately confirm its content. Still, the suspicions grew. The KGB placed covert cameras in stairwells near Penkovsky's apartment, bugged meeting rooms in GRU buildings, and deployed plainclothes agents around known MI6 routes. Slowly, evidence accumulated. Then came the decisive break. A KGB surveillance officer reported that Penkovsky had used a coded signal in his apartment window, an agreed communication method with his CIA handlers. This confirmed to the KGB that the leak was internally positioned at a high classification level. The rest. On October 22, 1962, the same day President Kennedy delivered his historic address about Cuba, Penkovsky attempted to contact his Western handlers again. The KGB intercepted him. That night, Penkovsky disappeared from Moscow streets. He had been arrested. CIA Moscow station learned about it within hours. MI6 confirmed the silence from Chisholm and Wynne. Both agencies knew exactly what the arrest meant. Penkovsky would face a secret Soviet tribunal. There would be no extradition, no prisoner exchange, and no diplomatic protest. He was too valuable, too dangerous, too deeply embedded. The spiral begins. Inside the Lubyanka, the notorious KGB headquarters, Penkovsky underwent prolonged interrogations. Soviet archives confirm he was shown photographs of Chisholm, Wynne, and other Western contacts. The KGB methodically dismantled every cover story he had ever used. The CIA, for its part, immediately destroyed or relocated all active Moscow assets connected to Penkovsky. The West knew the KGB would exploit the situation ruthlessly. But what the world didn't know then, and what only became clear after declassification, was that the Cuban Missile Crisis ended peacefully partly because of Penkovsky's intelligence, even as he was being interrogated in a KGB cell. After Oleg Penkovsky's arrest in late 1962, the KGB moved swiftly to dismantle every connection he had ever made. His apartment was searched from floor to ceiling. Hidden cameras and miniature film rolls were recovered. Even the tiny spy camera disguised as a cigarette pack, one of the tools he used to copy thousands of pages of classified Soviet military documents, was seized. For the first time, the KGB understood the scale of the breach. Inside the Lubyanka, the interrogations began. Soviet archives later confirmed that Penkovsky was questioned for months, sometimes for up to 14 hours a day. The KGB confronted him with surveillance photographs, intercepted messages, and testimonies extracted from individuals linked to his activities. They wanted every Western contact, every document passed, every dead drop site, every detail about CIA and MI6 methods. But Penkovsky remained controlled and precise. Western debriefing summaries released decades later show that the CIA believed he withheld key names deliberately to protect others, even under extreme pressure. The KGB, however, succeeded in confirming his meetings with both Grieville-Wynne, the MI6 courier arrested shortly after Penkovsky, and Janet Chisholm, whose diplomatic cover was immediately compromised. By early 1963, the KGB had built a complete case. The Soviet leadership needed an example, an unmistakable warning to discourage future defections. So, in May 1963, Penkovsky was brought before the military collegium of the Supreme Court in a closed trial that lasted only a few days. The proceedings were heavily controlled, attended by select officials and filmed for internal propaganda. Much of the footage remained classified until the early 1990s. The charges included state treason, espionage on behalf of the United States and United Kingdom, and revealing military secrets capable of weakening national defense, charges that carry the highest penalty under Soviet law. The verdict was inevitable. Penkovsky was found guilty and sentenced to death. According to the official Soviet record, he was executed by firing squad shortly after the trial. However, for decades, rumors persisted, fed by defectors, journalists, and even former KGB officers, that Penkovsky had been executed by a more brutal method, possibly cremated alive. No verified documents support this claim, and declassified files now confirm the execution was carried out in standard form. Still, the secrecy surrounding his case kept speculation alive well into the post-Cold War era. As for Wynne, the MI6 courier who had served as Penkovsky's link to the West, he received an 8-year sentence. He spent months in a Soviet prison before eventually being exchanged in a spy swap in 1964. Inside CIA headquarters, the news of Penkovsky's execution hit hard. Analysts understood that his intelligence had materially changed the outcome of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Senior officials later stated that Penkovsky provided more critical information than any single source during the Cold War. But in Moscow, his name was erased. Files were locked away. His story became classified for decades. And yet, the consequences of his bravery were not over. His intelligence continued shaping CIA strategy long after his death. When the CIA received final confirmation that Oleg Penkovsky had been executed, the reaction inside Langley was unlike anything seen since the agency's early years. Analysts and operations officers realized that Penkovsky had provided the West with intelligence so precise, so deeply embedded in the Soviet military structure, that it fundamentally shifted the balance during the Cuban Missile Crisis. But his death also forced the CIA to confront an uncomfortable truth. Their operational practices inside Moscow had been outmatched by the KGB's tightening surveillance apparatus. The Penkovsky case became a controlled internal study known simply as the Moscow Lessons. Declassified decades later, it shows how sharply the CIA responded. First, they concluded that Moscow was the most hostile, most surveilled environment in the world for human intelligence operations. Every Western embassy employee was monitored. Every diplomatic vehicle was tagged. Every route used more than once risk detection. Penkovsky had succeeded in spite of those conditions, but his exposure proved the KGB could track even the smallest irregularity. Inside MI6, similar soul-searching occurred. The roles played by Grieville-Wynne and Janet Chisholm were reviewed in detail. MI6 admitted that classic Cold War tradecraft, brush passes, dead letter drops, park bench meetings, had become dangerously predictable in Moscow. The Soviets were adapting faster than Western intelligence realized. Meanwhile, deep inside the KGB's headquarters at the Lubyanka, officers studied the Penkovsky case as a model for counterintelligence success. Recently released KGB training documents show that Penkovsky's detection became case number one for identifying foreign penetration. The KGB analyzed every signal, every mistake, and every surveillance pattern until they constructed a playbook for catching spies. For years afterward, any Soviet officer showing unusual movements, foreign curiosity, or unexplained access patterns was quietly investigated. The CIA, in turn, had to evolve. They began developing new generations of spy tools, miniature cameras disguised in pens, hollowed-out objects for document transfers, and the first experiments in drop sites disguised as pieces of urban infrastructure. These innovations were meant to prevent another Penkovsky tragedy, but none came soon enough to save him. Despite their grief, CIA officers understood that without Penkovsky's intelligence, the Cuban Missile Crisis might have ended differently. His detailed photographs of Soviet missile components gave Kennedy the confidence to negotiate instead of attack. His warnings about Soviet nuclear readiness prevented catastrophic miscalculations. A single Soviet colonel had quietly altered world history, only to be silenced by his own government. But Penkovsky's legacy did not end with his execution. His files continued shaping how American analysts viewed Soviet capabilities. His documents became part of training manuals for new CIA officers. For MI6, he remained the example of the rarest kind of source, deeply placed, highly motivated, and willing to sacrifice everything. Years later, as the Cold War evolved into new fronts, Berlin tunnels, satellite races, proxy wars, the CIA often looked back at the Penkovsky case. It served as both an achievement and a warning. Information could save nations, but acquiring it came at a human cost that was rarely acknowledged publicly. Penkovsky had protected the world from the shadows. Now the CIA had to protect the next generation of shadows from suffering the same fate. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the sealed archives of its intelligence services began to crack open. For decades, the name Oleg Penkovsky had been erased from public Soviet history, his existence denied, his actions buried, his execution unmentioned. But with the fall of the USSR, researchers finally gained access to thousands of internal documents. Slowly, the truth surfaced. Among the first revelations were the KGB's own internal assessments of Penkovsky. They confirmed everything the CIA and MI6 had suspected. Penkovsky had penetrated deeper into Soviet military secrets than any Western service had ever dreamed possible. His access allowed him to photograph missile blueprints, operational manuals, nuclear deployment charts, and high-level political directives. The documents were so sensitive that even many Soviet generals had never seen them. Western historians studying these newly opened archives realized that the Cuban Missile Crisis intelligence, once believed to be compiled from multiple sources, was overwhelmingly built on Penkovsky's material. His photographs had allowed American analysts to identify Soviet missiles in Cuba with absolute certainty. His manuals had explained their vulnerabilities. His warnings had highlighted Khrushchev's strategic uncertainty. For nearly 30 years, the world had debated what truly stopped the Cuban Missile Crisis from turning into nuclear war. Now, with Soviet files finally available, one conclusion emerged again and again. Without Penkovsky, the United States would have been operating in the dark. In Washington, the CIA declassified its own internal evaluations. They described Penkovsky as the most valuable human source of the Cold War. The agency later honored him in internal memorials, though his identity remained confidential to the public for decades. MI6 did the same. Greville Wynn's release in a prisoner exchange only confirmed how seriously the Soviets valued capturing Penkovsky's network. In Russia, journalists uncovered transcripts of Penkovsky's 1963 trial, once hidden as state secrets. They showed that the trial had been more of a performance than a legal proceeding. The outcome had been predetermined. But they also revealed Penkovsky's calmness and unwavering belief that his actions had helped prevent war. Even facing execution, he told the Soviet judges that he acted for the good of humanity. In the years that followed, books, documentaries, and academic studies revisited his story. Some exaggerated. Others speculated. But by cross-matching Soviet, American, and British files, now all partially public, a purely factual picture emerged. Penkovsky was not a double agent. He was not operating for personal gain. He was not driven by ideology alone. He was moved by a fear that Soviet leadership could miscalculate and destroy the world. He acted because he believed someone had to. Today, historians agree that Penkovsky's intelligence shortened the Cuban Missile Crisis, strengthened diplomatic decision-making, and provided the United States with unprecedented insight into Soviet nuclear strategy. His work saved lives, millions, possibly tens of millions, without the world ever knowing his name at the time. And so the man who protected America from the shadows remained hidden until history finally caught up. This was not a spy thriller. It was real. It was documented. And for decades, it was forgotten.